The scripture today is Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through 22, and chapter 8, verses 6 through 12, and chapter 9, verses 8 through 17. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with the animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I'm going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in the ark, cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its width, 50 cubits, and its height, 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and put the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For my part, I am going to bring a flood on the waters of the earth, to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything on earth shall die, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, your sons' wives with you. And every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind. 2 of every kind shall come into you, and keep them alive. Also, take with you every kind of food that is eaten, and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he made and sent out a raven, and it went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Then he sent out the dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the earth. But the dove found no place to set its foot, and it returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took it and brought it into the ark with him. He waited another 7 days, and again he sent out the dove from the ark. And the dove came back to him in the evening, and there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So no one knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent out the dove, and it did not return to him anymore. Then the God said to Noah and to his sons, As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal on earth with you, and as many as came out of the ark. I established my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, This is a sign of the covenant I make between me and you, and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on earth." Friends, listen to what these words mean to us today.
That probably needs a prayer. Will you join me in prayer? Holy and loving God, may we struggle with your word. May it be a blessing to us and all that we meet in the world. Amen. Last year, a friend of mine posted a question on Facebook asking why a loving God would send a flood and then proceed to commit genocide. And then asked all of his friends who work for churches or work for Christianity to answer it. My response was twofold. One was that we have to discuss the role of the Bible, about how we interpret it, its place in history. And the other answer was like, we just really like animals and they can be really cute. The story of Noah's Ark in art is really cute if you put it in a nice pastel color, and it's just a bunch of animals looking over the side of the boat as they sail across the open waters. On the other hand, it is horrifying if you take this text literally. And the images of the things that are floating in the waters around them. The story of Noah and the ark and the flood are some horrific combination of a children's story and an apocalyptic nightmare. And there are some who work really hard to prove that it is true. They do all kinds of math to prove that you could fill it with so many animals. And then they build the boat with the dimensions that are given in the text. And it turns out, even if you build the boat, it might not be seaworthy, because the one they built in Kentucky suffered some water damage from their last floods. And it seems that they do all of this with the assumptions that the most important thing that they are doing is convincing folks that it happened just like this, literally, in history, that the Bible says, and it happened. And I disagree. I don't think that is the most important thing about this story. The story of Noah and most of Genesis fall into what we generally consider prehistory. There isn't really a time frame given. It's just sort of out there in the ether. It's the myths of creation, of how and why the world is as it is. Who are these humans living on the earth? It is myth, and it is metaphor, and it is parable. And it tells the truth, even if it didn't happen this way. It tells us something about God that might be a little bit scary. And it tells us something about humanity that might ring true still today. And it tells us something about creation. The story of Noah is a story of recreation. With word and breath and clay, God made everything and named it good. God made humans, and they were complicated. From the very beginning, humans wanted things. They wanted fruit. They wanted knowledge. They wanted affirmation. And we could look at each one of those things as they are mundane, even good: food for sustenance and survival, knowledge for wisdom and understanding, affirmations because we all need love. But those desires have a downside, a negative extreme. taking more than one needs or taking it from someone else. It makes sustenance that doesn't value another person. Knowledge that doesn't come with wisdom, but rather the ability to benefit from a system that benefits some and not others. And seeking affirmation and affection in a way that diminishes yourself or others through abuse, assault, or manipulation. There are ways to live with our desires well, and there are ways to live with them that are detriment to another. They can lead to violence. And one other translation says outrage. They might even look evil. As humans, we are capable of great good and great beauty, great creativity, and great love, but we are also capable of great violence, great offense against each other, and great injustice. And God had made this whole creation good. And as time passed and God looked down at it, apparently from a distance, God saw the outrage and the violence of humanity. All that had been perfect and good had multiplied into evil. Did you know there's a whole collection of images of people trying really hard to make the same thing someone else made and failing miserably? They're often called Pinterest fails because Pinterest is the home of all wonderful things in the world until you try it yourself. These aren't mine, by the way. I take no responsibility for that. But I like to think of myself as a creative person, or I want to be. But the problem is I have these great ideas in my head, and there's no drawing and almost no photograph I take, and nothing real, no craft I do, no writing I do that quite comes out the way that it is in my head. Bob Ross says that there are no mistakes, only happy accidents. But they feel like mistakes when I look at them, and they're disappointing. And I wonder if that's what God thought about the work of creation, that it wasn't quite the way they had planned, that it wasn't a happy accident anymore, but that really there had been a mistake. God decides to paint over the canvas or shake the Etch-a-Sketch. And it's wild to think about God having made a mistake, or at least believing that God had made a mistake. But this is a story of a God who regrets and then makes mistakes and then regrets and starts over again. The very first thing that God does in our story is make a plan to wipe the slate clean, to destroy everything. The very second thought of God is to preserve something, preserve people and animals. And while God's first thought goes to destruction, the second one is way longer, with detailed instructions on how to salvage it. God spends significantly more time telling Noah how to save the world rather than how it's going to be destroyed. See, I imagine God like a parent on a road trip with their kids, and it's hour 2, and you have 8 more to go. And then it's gotten overwhelming, and your first response is to yell for them to be quiet for just like 5 minutes. And you may do that, and then you remember your better self, and that these are children, and they're your children, and they're just going to be loud, and they're going to be full of questions. And no one likes to sit still for a long time if they're not in charge of the radio, and they're curious. I imagine when you're trying to teach your children something because they want to be helpful and they have to learn things, but they do it wrong. And you can respond with frustration, or you can respond with grace, because they aren't going to do it the same way you would. And that might be okay. And to be honest, this is a grace we should probably extend to our significant others, to other people in our lives, our coworkers. Like, they're not going to do it exactly the same way you are, and that's going to be okay. See, when the rains were over, when the water had cleared, and they returned to where they lived, when Noah and the family and all of the creatures had found their way back to the land, God took a deep breath. Noah had built an altar. God breathed in the fragrance and realized humans aren't going to change. God was just about to tell Noah to go forth and to multiply, just like God had told them to way earlier in the story for other humans, and they are going to multiply evil, just like they did before. There would also be good, and there would be desires that lead people to goodness, and there would be desires that lead people to evil. And God, as if God had a really good therapist, said, humans aren't going to change, so I'm going to have to. God was going to have to take a different approach than the one that would see creation as something observed from afar off, that is supposed to be perfect. God is going to need to not get so caught up in the perfection that they miss the good. God realizes that violence isn't going to fix violence, and that a second mistake isn't going to fix the first. And so God hangs their bow in the sky, God's weapon. It's God's first thought of destruction. And they hang it in the sky as a reminder, not to humans, but for God's self. As a reminder to not start with the idea of the world functioning perfectly, but to start with relationship. God makes a covenant with the whole of creation because God is choosing to work with the world that we have here, with these people and these creatures, even if they aren't perfect, and even if they do wrong, even if they choose violence and outrage. This is the world God has chosen. And that is who God has become after the flood. The God who would make a covenant with creation, with the people and the animals, the ones that fly and crawl and swim, with every tree and every flower. The God that we see after the flood is the one who gives guidelines and teaches the ways of compassion and justice. It is the God who sets the captives free, who gives them enough to live, who heals and forgives. It is the God after the flood who will come to earth in flesh and show us what love looks like when it's lived out. This is the first of many commandments and promises, agreements that God makes with humans and the earth. And those are the ones we'll look at this fall and winter. But the question is, who do we become after the flood? The flood is the symbol of one world ending and a new one beginning. Who do we become when our world has ended? There is recreation and there is resurrection. There is life after the world ends. So who are we going to be in the midst of it? It could be anything. Our world ending could be anything. It could be global and it could be really personal. It's the end of a relationship. And that vision of who you are and who you are going to be in the future that was connected to that one person, and all of the hopes and all of the plans, and they're all gone and they will never be. That is a world ending. But it could be the loss of a job, or your home, or a family member, a friend, a move. It could be the loss of an ideology, a belief system, an election. Who do we become when our world ends? Do we turn into ourselves? Do we choose anger, outrage? Do we settle and live in regret? Our world is in the midst of floods and disasters, droughts and fires. Whole homes and towns and ways of life are being destroyed as islands disappear underwater. Who do they become? And who do we become in the midst of it? Do we stand here in our safe place, believing that while it rains today, it will not flood? Feeling blessed and separated from those around the world and down the street who are suffering and struggling? Do we respond in grief and anger? Do we just live in that? Do we choose violence when our world ends? 21 years ago, today, in many ways, one world ended. At the end of the Cold War brought an optimism that was the 90s, my golden years right there. And the optimism of the 90s came crashing down in New York City on this day in 2001. In many ways, who we became when the world ended were people who wanted to do good for each other, whom were moved in kindness and were connected. And for a brief moment, we hung our bows, promising unity, and then very quickly we grabbed them back, and we have lived with that consequence for the last 20 years. It's not just war, but it is abuses heaped upon anyone who looked Middle Eastern, of any religion. Who do we become? And we have lived, are living, forever living through a pandemic that was kind of world ending. And for a moment, it seemed like we were coming together as a humanity, and yet it still seemed like maybe that coming together was way shorter than it's ever been. But we are still figuring out who we are going to be on this side of the world ending. Who will we become? You and me and all of us together, we're not the same. We can't go back to 21 and 1 day ago, and we can't go back to January 2020. The floods have come, and the world as it was has ended, and we've changed too. And we are going to multiply something, whether it is community or division, gratitude or greed, generosity or accumulation. And the church has a unique place in the world, even if we, the universal church, have often failed to live into it. We have a unique place to be the place where all kinds of people come together with a promise that we are going to choose relationships over perfection. We're going to choose relationships over outrage and violence. We're going to choose to honor God's relationship and covenant with all of creation instead of manipulation and exploitation and neglect. We are going to see God as our example, naming our mistakes and making a plan to do better for each other. Who are we going to be after the world ends? Is there something you need to hang up? To remind yourself to choose relationship over perfection and anger? Is there a community that needs to be cared for? Is there somebody who needs community? Because this is one of the reasons why we have church, why we gather together, or as often as we can, to nourish each other, to care for each other, to choose relationship over perfection. We learn to grow and learn and become together. We struggle with ideas, and we still choose each other. And it is the reason that we expand and we extend and we invite and we reach out to others, because it isn't to force them to believe what we believe, but it is because we are better, all of us, in community. We are more likely to choose good when we have each other to count on. So, who are we going to be after the flood? After the world ends? May we be church, a church that is a community over division, that chooses gratitude over greed and generosity over accumulation. May we be people of God who make mistakes and learn from them and grow, that God, our God, may be our example to always choose relationship. And so may we live and may we learn in love. Amen.